I'm Yvonne Okwara Matole. Good evening. Our big story tonight, it's all about business. Kenya has been ranked third in sub-Saharan Africa in the 2017 World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index. The country has moved up 12 places to a global ranking of 80. However, many players continue to cite the long electioneering period we've just been through as affecting Kenya's economic potential. The current inflation rate is at 5.72%, and that's according to the Kenya Bureau of Statistics. Tonight, we will be discussing why the nexus between politics, electioneering, and the economy, and indeed where we go from here now that we seem to be through and over that hurdle. We'll be discussing this and the projections for the subsequent year right here on the show. So let me tell you who we have tonight. We will definitely be speaking to the Cabinet Secretary in charge of Treasury. That is Bwana Henry Rotich, to understand where Kenya is in terms of economic growth. He will be with our lead reporter, Sophia Wanuna. We also have the CEO of the Kenya Private Sector Alliance, that's Carol Kariuki, as well as Joy Kiru, who's an economist and lecturer at the University of Nairobi. But first, because we're talking business and numbers, I want to bring in now Paul Wafula, who is our senior business reporter with the Standard newspaper, to just talk a little bit more about this and give our conversation some context this evening. Paul, good evening. It's good to speak to you once again. So let's just start by understanding where we are. I mean, obviously, the economy has been a great talking point when it came to the electioneering period, the demonstrations that were witnessed, the fact that we had to go through a repeat presidential exercise. So talk to us about the effect of the long electioneering period on Kenya's economy.
Yvonne, if you look at what has been happening in the economy from January to, let's say, after the repeat presidential poll, you'll find that the economy has actually been running on, so to speak, one engine. And anything that has been, any small turbulence that will come in, you'll find a lot of shivering that happens. For instance, you remember when we started the year, inflation was quite manageable. It was within the central Bank of Kenya's target, which is less than 7%. But as the year picked up, we shot up to over 11%, and that even was one of the issues that came up at that point. And then before that, we had the first quarter economic growth that you find we had actually shrunk up to about 4.9%. That is, we had a situation whereby the economy now was softening, and investors, there was a lot of a kind of fear, and the first people who were afraid were the foreign investors. And one of the sectors that was hit most was the Nairobi Securities Exchange. And we had a lot of investors taking off. Right now, things seem to be coming back in terms of maybe the concerns that were there. But that is the top numbers. If you looked at the World Bank report that was just released, we are now at number 80. That looks good. If you look at the inflation, it's come back down to 5%. But if you look at the actual dynamics in the economy, what really the issues that are there, if you look at for instance, if you look at the common man on the street, that is maybe the person who is living below $1 per day, you find that those are the people who have been worst hit. So the general inflation could be 5%, but the top line is that somebody else is buying more. And now, when you look at the other thing that is very important on the economic front is debt. Now, this is something that government will always like to suppress and talk as if there's nothing going on there. But the moment you find that the government cannot be able to fund its obligations, that is maybe pay salaries and civil servants. Remember, even after the election, you realize that we had issues with even paying lecturers, and the government was starting to struggle because of collection. You realize the counties were having a problem because they found their coffers empty and they could not even start. So all this was because of the compression that was happening in the economy. If you spoke to all the CEOs, most were afraid even to come up in the open, but the inside the boardrooms, they were really struggling. They were looking at how do we cut down on jobs. You find banks shed off about 2,000 people. Yes, Yvonne?
Yeah, the question I wanted to ask is specifically when we hear of all of these big numbers. I mean, if you recall, after the Supreme Court announced its verdict in September, then we heard of the billions that were wiped off of that. So for many, they understood it to be a loss. But what was it? Because even from the National Chamber of Commerce, we're hearing about, what, 700 billion shillings that's been lost, you know, over the last few months as we've been going through an election. So what do those figures mean for me and for the economy and for my purchasing power?
Maybe just to break it down, what happened at the Nairobi Securities Exchange. Immediately, Maraga and team went out and nullified the presidential election. The following 2 days, the NSE lost about 130 billion Kenya shillings. This happens where you find that, for instance, today your share price, your share, if you had a share in a company, one of the blue chip companies on the NSE, let's say it was costing so much, it was valued at this price. The following day, it tumbles and it loses a value on the NSE. So if you want to sell your share, you realize that you will get less money than what it was. So if you calculated the total market capitalization of all the companies that were there, you find that the NSE lost about 130 billion. Now, the second thing that you mentioned down there was on the issue of what the private sector was saying about 700 billion. That was on the GDP growth. You find that their concern was that I mean, if you look at the entire space, you walk on the streets and you'll find businesses mostly they are operating with windows closed. That if something happens, they pull down the shutter. So the sales were really down, and there was a lot of concern because if you find the economy maybe slowing by about 10%, according to them in terms of the sales and whatever, you'll find that the ability to produce will go down by about 10%. That is what they put the value to be 700 billion. Even these numbers are still not really cast in stone, but it was an indication, just an estimate to be able to show that what will be happening. But now, yes.
Yes, and now that we're moving, well, it seems, but we still have about 14 days to see what happens if indeed anybody goes to the Supreme Court and if the Supreme Court would annul the election and we go back into a period like that. I mean, but what do we have to look forward to, Paul, in the coming year? I mean, we're currently in the middle of a financial year, but if you take a look at the calendar year, 2017 is done. We're going into 2018. What are some of the things that we need to be looking out for in terms of strengthening the economy? The interest rate cap is still in place, and many saying that'll be an issue. But remember, we also took a couple of loans for infrastructure, didn't we?
Yes, Yvonne, and if you remember, some of the big loans that we had, for instance, like the Standard Gauge Railway, they are coming due. You find loans like we took a syndicated loan, about 73 billion is also coming due, and the Treasury Cabinet Secretary should be able to talk about this. And if you look at even the latest numbers in terms of the ability to repay the loan, you remember all the international credit agencies, they have actually put Kenya on a watch list in that they're planning to downgrade it because they see our ability to be able to repay debt is in a problem. Remember, Yvonne, recently, the latest KRF figures showed that we are about 50 billion shy of what we needed to collect to be able to fund this. So anytime the government gets any money out, the first thing that they have to do is to pay debt. If they can be able to pay debt, the second thing they'll be doing is now to be able to do the recurrent. That is maybe paying salaries for civil servants, building a buying drugs and so on and so forth. And then the third thing that will come, if there's any extra that is left, it will be now to do the development expenditure, which actually influences everything else.
And what does that mean for me, Paul? What does that mean for my viewer watching tonight?
What it means is that government as it is today, it is going to stop or even cut off most of the development expenditure that is there. Then secondly, it's going to have a problem with trying to meet its obligation. That is the main things in terms of paying salaries, wages, and lastly, in terms of paying loans to the international creditors. So that will be a concern that we have to look at. Because if the economy, if you look at the graph, Yvonne, you realize that the borrowing has been going up consistently. And the economic growth has actually been coming down. The first quarter, if you check the last 4 years, you'll find we've been performing worse off than we did 4 years ago. So if you're borrowing about 300 billion every year, and now they're coming on board, we have to start repaying it. The infrastructure that we did build has not yet started giving us what we expected in terms of, we are yet to get the actual dividends from big investments like some of the roads, some of the Standard Gauge Railway is yet to actually give us any dividends yet. So all these things are coming and they're maturing, but we're not yet ready because the election period has actually costed us about 7-8 months of growth.
Yeah, of growth and of collecting revenue. Thank you for that, Paul Wafula, who is our senior business reporter at The Standard. So it's now time for us to hear it from the man himself, and that is the Cabinet Secretary in charge of Treasury, and he's with Sophia Wanuna right now. Sophia?
Good evening, Yvonne. A long electioneering period Kenya has witnessed this time around, and there's been a lot of analysis about what impact that has had on Kenya's economy. And we're at Treasury building tonight. The man in charge of Treasury, Cabinet Secretary Henry Rotich, is with us. Thank you so much, CS, for making time for the big story. And one of the things I've had my colleague talk about as we're looking at where we are as a country and the economy is a question around the nation, Kenya, been unable to pay some of the salaries. And today we've seen that nurses' strike finally come to an end after 5 months. Why did it take so long? Let's start there before we go to the elections and the impact of the same, because all along what we heard from Treasury is that there is no money. So where did the money come from?
Well, first, it was unfortunate that it had to take quite long to resolve the nurses' issue. As you recall, we had long discussions early this year or even late last year on all the strikes that happened, especially in the medical sector. And to our recollection, I think a lot had been done, and we had virtually agreed in most of the terms, and which were to be implemented beginning July this financial year. But from then, really, other issues emerged, which caused the strike again to happen at the time when people were very busy with the electioneering, so to speak. And then, of course, there wasn't a lot of attention on these discussions.
So it wasn't much of a priority?
Well, I wouldn't say that, but it's really, as you know, a majority of the employees of the nurses are county employees. And as you know, most of the governors were busy electioneering and trying to come back. And so the issue of really discussing and sorting out this matter probably took longer than would have happened in a normal circumstances where there is more focus and attention at that time. Yeah.
All right, let's get back to the elections. And the economy was to grow 6%. We understand it has dropped 1.2 percentage point. Is that correct?
Yeah, this year we were expecting to grow at around 6.1%. Certainly that's not the case now. We have data for the first half of this year, which indicate that the economy grew at around, on average, about 4.9 or 5 thereabout. So for the year now, we have revised our growth downwards to about 5% for the all year of 2017, down from the 6.1 that we had expected. Basically because of combination of factors. As you know, early this year we had the drought, which impacted negatively on the food sector and agriculture. And coupled with that is the issues of election, which affected in a way business activity by way of uncertainties that came with it. And overall, then we saw sort of a slowing down of the economy. But even with those, I would still say that the economy continued to be resilient, growing at 5% at this particular time, when sub-Saharan Africa's average growth is around 3%, is still respectable. Okay. But would have done much better, obviously, were it not for the challenges that we had.
So when KEPSA says we lost 700 billion shillings, that is an astounding amount of money over these last 4 months. Is that a figure you agree with? And if so, in what areas have we lost it?
Well, I would say I wouldn't know how KEPSA came up with 700 billion, really. What I can easily say is that from the figures I've just given you, we have revised our growth to 5%, which is a 1 percentage point down. This is equivalent to about 80 billion Kenya shillings reduction. So I would say we're looking at to the tune of that, probably slightly higher than that. But so
you think that's an exaggeration, 700 billion?
I need to understand how they come up with. I don't know how they calculated. What I know, as I said, was we have the cost of this electioneering plus what I've said about the drought is about 1% of our GDP. 1% of our GDP of about 8 trillion is about 80 billion. So I would probably say that apart from the 80 billion, we have, of course, in the revenue side, we have not been able to collect our revenues to the tune of about 40 billion. and some expenditure pressure. So I would put it in the tune of probably 120, 130 billion thereabout. Yeah.
The impact of elections on our economy, this happens every electioneering year. Is there not anything that can be done to avoid the same? Is it just something Kenyans should expect?
Well, it used to happen quite frequent in the past. If you look at elections in 1992, 1997, 2000, we certainly had a big reduction in growth. And also, of course, in post-election violence in 2007. But since then, with the reforms that were taken, especially the constitutional reforms, including the new constitution, we saw even in 2013 that growth did not dip so much. And even this year, as I said, we expected 6, we still grew by 5, still better. Of course, it should have been much better than we expected. But what I'm saying basically is that certain things in the economy has changed, unlike before, where clearly people used to fear during an election period that there's clearly going to be either clashes or things that affect the economy. But I think we have sort of come out of that in a way. But obviously, not completely. As you know, we had this year to face these challenges. But I think I would attribute this to more prolonged sort of electioneering. Doing 2 elections in 1 year is quite unique from the past. And that probably accounts for the decline, our slowdown of growth this year. But the previous years was certainly because of a recurrence of post-election violence every time we have an election. But we came out of that in 2013. We didn't have a post-election violence. This year, we are not anticipating any, despite the challenges. And I'm saying that there's more stability now going forward because of the reforms that has happened.
CS, let's talk about the elephant in the room, the debt. It has doubled from Kibaki's regime to Kenyatta's regime twice, as I mentioned, they're doubling. And a lot of this concerning many, and we're feeling the stretch as a country. What is the plan?
Well, first, you know, when you ask that question, first you should ask yourself, when you say debt has doubled, what other things must have also doubled, including our infrastructure investments, including our GDP expansion. So this debt has suddenly gone to increase the productive capacity of the economy in a way. So to look at it from a static point of view and say, oh, 2002, debt was X. Now it's 2 times X.
But let's talk a little bit more,
sir. You need to know that debt went into, in 2002, we didn't have a railway line. It was constructed through a debt, obviously. So we have a debt now converted into real activity. So basically what I'm saying is that you have to look at it in a dynamic way. Not the debt is like this and it's now this. And any progressive economy finances its progress or development by way of raising its own revenue or accessing capital elsewhere. And that is common, even an individual. So that's how you grow. So what I'm basically telling you is that debt that is used rightly for investments, public investments, which help to increase the productive capacity of the economy, are good debts. It's only bad debts that if you use it for consumption and you have left with nothing to grow the economy in the future.
You say good debt, sir, but we're beginning to see interest arrears as a country, which is a concern. But more specifically is what some analysts have argued, and as far as being able to meet those interests we are meant to be paying. But to the question of the focus on infrastructure. Kibaki, 10 years, we saw focus on infrastructure. The first 5 years of Kenyatta, infrastructure, talking about increasing that production capacity. So 15 years of infrastructure and a growing debt. At what point do we reprioritize or think maybe this is not really working out as we thought it would?
First, let me correct you that there's not the interest arrears. I'm not aware that we are accumulating arrears. We have on time. On payment of our debt. If there was an arrears, somebody must be complaining that have not been paid their debt. So those analysts are completely wrong. Now, to your point, this economy we have a huge, huge infrastructure gap. We have not even met it. As we speak, we still need more water systems. We still need more expansion in energy in terms of first the production and also the transmission connecting, connecting household and many other investments. And of course the roads, airports and the like. This infrastructure must be met by many ways. Your own revenues that you collect, plus any other sources. But of course, when you borrow to ensure that you borrow in a sustainable manner. And this is what we have been saying all around. Basically, borrowing in a sustainable manner means that you're borrowing to ensure that you don't enter into a debt distress in the future. But borrow and invest and fill your infrastructure gap now because you need it. Because you cannot talk about addressing other things if your energy costs are high or there's no power in the country. Or if the roads are not there, how do you expect people to carry their goods on transport? So first things first, you need to fix your infrastructure. And this is what we have done. During Kibaki's administration, started a program on infrastructure. The Jubilee administration from 2013 has expanded that further. Now, I would really say that we have reached a point where we are feeling that we have more comfort in terms of the infrastructure that we need. And that is why in the next round of things where we are, the focus going forward is to now begin to get industries to take advantage of the foundations that we have laid. In this case, we have brought down the cost of power. It's available, unlike before that it was high and it was limited in supply. We can now transport goods speedily from Mombasa to Nairobi through railway or through other road networks. And many other things, water and other infrastructure is now available. Okay. Now, industries need to seize the opportunity now, and this is where we are focusing. We have had Jubilee manifesto in the next 5 years is to look at industrialization. Now we need that to get jobs moving forward. And that is that could not have happened in 2013 or 10 years ago, because how do you get the private sector working if there are no the critical infrastructure? So that is what we had to focus. It had to be done because previous governments did not put a lot of efforts on it. So you had to fix that. And then now bring in this private sector to invest in industries and create jobs, and that's where we are now.
So attention would shift from infrastructure if Uhuru Kenyatta is sworn in?
Absolutely. If you had a chance to look at the Jubilee manifesto when they were launched, it's very clear. More focus on now job creation. And because we have laid the foundation. We have laid the foundation. Now the next thing is get the industry. That's why we have talked of leather. We have talked of textile. We are looking at motor industry. We have already created the incentive for that to come in. We are looking at another focus is housing sector. Shelter must be, increased now. The urban population is rising quickly, and these are areas that we want to put more emphasis now going forward because we have a foundation. If we didn't have invested in that, I'm very sure any government by now would be thinking of first to fix the infrastructure. But we have done that.
The interest rate cap, I beg your pardon, what do you say to many that it's hurting, the millions that have been affected by this? Are we relooking it?
Well, this issue of interest rate cap is something that has been an issue for a long time. We have, of course, tried to deal it in various ways. From our perspective here, we've tried to look at, what are the necessary reforms we need to do in the financial sector to get interest rates down so that we avoid the issue of, controls in this sector. But look, it has taken a while to get these reforms up and running. Some are structural reforms that requires a lot of commitment, especially in many other sectors, particularly, issues of collateral. You have to talk of how, judgments are done in courts and land registries and all that. Those reforms take a while, and that is the reason why interest rates have not come down speedily. And it is out of that, because of those frustrations, the interest rate caps were introduced. Of course, with consequences, as you know very well. When the president was signing this, he mention that it would certainly have consequences. But we are monitoring. We're looking at how do we ensure that these consequences, which would be negative, as you already pointed out, access to credit has become a little bit a challenge because it was sort of in a cap situation. It's expected, but look, we are discussing, monitoring, and analyzing the impacts of this this consequence that was unintended. Now, with a view to obviously take appropriate actions going forward to ensure that we do not reverse our gains that we have had, especially in financial inclusion and the like. So look, we are now 1 year in the CAPS, but certainly we now have enough data to ask ourselves whether this issue is something that we need to revisit at this particular time, or we move speedily to address it from different angles.
Okay. Final question, CS. We're in a country, we're not meeting our targets in as far as collection of revenue. KRA never meets their collection targets. We have a wage bill that's more than half in as far as the population. It goes to 2% of the leadership. So a bulk of it not going to ordinary Mwananchi. We have being stretched as far as salaries are concerned. Corruption, leakages is also a huge concern. The debt, a big concern. Kenyans are feeling the pinch. What do you tell them tonight?
Yeah, certainly we are addressing these challenges. The revenue shortfall that we have seen is out of us not being able to achieve the economic target growth, which I just indicated to you earlier on. And we are taking measures from the fiscal point of view. We are readjusting our budgets to ensure that the revenues that we are collecting tries to match the expenditure that we are currently planned ourselves to undertake in this fiscal year. You certainly saw the actions we did in the supplementary budget. Very radical move to adjust expenditures, because we had to provide, of course, some pressing expenditures, including providing for the election. But on top of that, there are many other radical things we have done. We have certainly instituted a very tough austerity measures to ensure that we finance and live within our means in a way, because of the constraints that has arisen out of the revenue shortfall. The issues of wage bill, I think I had indicated to you that we have tried to resolve this in many ways. The SRC has come up with a program of how to deal with wages once and for all, in terms of reviews that was done. These reviews now, once implemented now, will not be again adjusted for the next 4 years.
So in your view, the state of the economy is good?
I would definitely say so. We have challenges, obviously, that we are addressing. I just mentioned to you that the economy remained resilient despite of this. Okay. But I don't want to say I'm painting a very rosy picture. What is so critical really is that we stay on course. We avoid, again, putting the economy in a more stress, the position that we have just had over the last few months. And I think going forward, if we get back to business, get things moving, the future is very bright.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. Many thanks, CS.
Thank you.
Many thanks. Henry Rotich, Cabinet Secretary, Treasury, speaking to us on the state of the economy. Optimistic that things will get better. We're taking a short break here on The Big Story. Yvonne Okwara Matola will be back with the rest of the show.